Hi there, welcome back. This is the final video of a 6-part series on modeling for clarity, a workshop from the Understanding Group. I'm Joe Elmendorf. In this final video, I want to take all of what we've learned about how to make good models and shift that understanding from making good models to critiquing others' models. The reason I made the clear modeling framework was because I lacked a way to get and give meaningful feedback from and to others about models. Critiques are a common review process in the art, design, and architecture fields. The purpose of a model critique is about making a model better able to fulfill its intended purpose. For those who aren't familiar with critiques, here's a quick primer on what we mean when we say critique. Critiques typically take place in a session-like format where the modeler presents their in-progress models and shares their model program. The participants of the critique engage in critical thinking to determine whether the model is able to achieve its stated intent. A critique taps into the wisdom and diversity of perspectives of all those participating, and it's a fun and engaging conversation in the spirit of enriching a model. A critique session is an opportunity to propagate a shared framework of vocabulary and understanding amongst all the participants. What critiques aren't for is generating new ideas or brainstorming. They're about refining and reframing. So for our purposes, this means if an idea doesn't fit within the bounds outlined by the model program, it can be a suggestion for later, but it doesn't belong in the critique. For this reason, critique sessions are often mildly facilitated to help keep things on track and in scope. Before going on, I want to be clear about the difference between critique by a peer and the evaluation that you might get from the intended audience of a model or your client. The audience of a model basically evaluates a model by a couple things. A, was the model understandable? And B, did it actually help in getting them closer to their overarching goal? A person using your model often has better things to do than learn about these cards. At Tug, we always have a peer review before we deliver something to a client. Meaning, one of our Tug colleagues, someone not involved with making that deliverable, looks it over, makes sure there aren't any careless errors, and that things generally make sense. Sometimes it's another information architect, sometimes it's an intern, sometimes it's a marketing person. The skills required for a peer review aren't ones of an expert modeler or even someone with an understanding of the project context. All a peer reviewer needs to do is make sure that the deliverable is free of obvious mistakes. Often when I'll hand a file off to someone for peer review, I'll cheekily say, "Please make sure that I'm not an idiot, thanks." So that's a peer review. But sometimes I need more than just a spelling and consistency check. Sometimes I need someone to provide actual feedback on whether or not the thing I'm about to deliver is any good at what it's supposed to do. Because sometimes I can be too close to my models and I need an external perspective to find additional problems with it. Years ago, before having this modeling framework for critique, if I needed critical feedback, I would have to go through the process of walking someone through the project and explaining why I made the decisions I made, filling them in on what context I expected my intended audience to have. But in addition to that, we would also have to struggle to frame critique in a way that would be understood. And we would reinvent the wheel every time we gave each other feedback. There was no set way for us to talk about things. And while each of my colleagues is a very good modeler in their own right, we each had a different way of conceptualizing what it is that we meant. A translation effort was needed to make sure that what was offered by the critic was understood by the modeler. And so what would happen, unfortunately, was that sometimes I wouldn't seek out critical feedback because of this extra effort that was required. This was a problem because when I don't invite critique of my models, both my client and I are missing out. Because multiple sets of eyes on something are always better than one. Dissecting this problem a bit, there are two main challenges when it comes to critiquing models. One isn't addressed by this Clear Models framework, and the other is. The challenge that is not addressed is a mismatch of context, which happens when your critic has even less context than your audience. The model maker works hard to make sure that the model is understood by a particular audience, but by nature of a critique, the critic is often not a part of that audience. This is common for consultants or those of you providing a service within your organization. So while a model might do what it needs to do for the people it's supposed to do it for, the critic might not be able to see this due to their differing context. It isn't about trusting the person critiquing your model or the quality of that person's critiquing ability. It's a pervasive struggle that comes from having a different perspective. But that very struggle is what makes critique so powerful. We as modelers need that outside perspective to refine and improve our models. The second challenge that I found when critiquing models, and the reason I wanted to make this Clear Models framework, was so that my colleagues and I could have a shared vocabulary to talk about models. You've seen how many different dimensions there are to models, how many different ways and approaches you could take in modeling one seemingly simple thing. Before we had a clear set of language to talk about these important and recurring parts of models, we struggled to clearly express feedback and concerns. So even once we had overcome that first struggle of mismatched context, we still struggled to effectively communicate because we didn't refer to things in the same way. The Clear Models framework offers a solution to this problem. It provides a shared vocabulary, a shared language by which modeler and critic can talk about the variety of considerations and aspects of a model. While a shared language about models in general doesn't do much to help with the context mismatch, it does alleviate one part of the struggle found when providing critique. The process of critique that's being put forth here isn't really much different than any other method of critique you may have participated in other situations. But here, we're applying it to the modeling context and using the Clear Models framework as our shared critique vocabulary. This is the card that we haven't been over yet. It's the 2 ways to play card. On one side, it outlines the steps of creating a model, just as we've gone over in the past videos. And on the other side, it offers a second way to play with these cards when critiquing. The choreography or how to critique someone else's model isn't complicated, and you already know what it takes to make a clear model for yourself. So let's look at the first step. These instructions assume that you are someone who is familiar with the modeling framework and are critiquing a model that is not yours. So you are the critic now, not the modeler. Step 1. We need to lay out the model being critiqued and the model program side by side. You want to be able to look at them in both and consult the model program as needed for context. Now, maybe the modeler hasn't taken this workshop. Maybe they don't know what a model program is. That's okay. It's a helpful and constructive step in a critique to take a model that is underway and retroactively create a model program for it. The placard still acts as a form to guide the start of the conversation. Worst case scenario, the modeler realizes they don't have an intent, or they don't know what aspects they've focused on, or they can't pin down an audience. And I say worst case, but even that isn't that bad, because those are the first steps to creating a clear model. Identifying their absence is a critique in and of itself. Best case scenario, the modeler quickly fills out the model program placard for the model you're about to critique, and you're on your way. Step 2. With the model and the program side by side, you read the model program placard to understand what the model is supposed to do and what you shouldn't be worried about. Who is the intended audience? Do they have lots of context or not much? Models that are made for an audience with a lot of context are likely going to cause some context mismatch between you, the critic, and the intended audience. Models for an audience with little context should pose less of a challenge, as you may have just as little context for this model as the intended audience. Use the audience's context slider as a gauge, and as you move through the critique, compare the position on the slider with how much effort it takes to close the context mismatch gap. When you look at the aspects the modeler selected on the placard, do you see those reflected in the model? Have they included more aspects or less aspects? Is the level of abstraction consistent with what they indicated? This process allows you to clarify and understand these points of uncertainty with the modeler. Sometimes the uncertainty will come as a result of the context mismatch I talked about earlier. Other times, it's indicative of a model that isn't as effective as it could be. Step 3. With the model's intent in mind, try and figure out at a high level whether or not the model as a whole is able to deliver on the stated intent. Think of it as a macro metric, a giant thumbs up or thumbs down. This first high-level evaluation helps you know whether providing critique beyond the items on the model program placard is even necessary. If the model completely misses the mark, we know that we don't need to go into detail of the consideration or context priming cards because it's likely that many things still need to change. Maybe the model is trying to do too much or including too many aspects, or is at the wrong level of abstraction. Step 4. After performing the initial high-level evaluation of the intent, work through each card in the consideration series and the context priming series. Each card serves as a different lens through which to frame the critique. They're like heuristics or best practices to guide the types of questions you can ask the modeler as you both review the model. For the consideration cards, work your way through each one, considering how that concept relates to the model. You don't necessarily have to talk about each card if the model is nice and clear on that point, but for others you can use the card as a jumping off point for discussion. Does the level of detail shown serve the intent of a model? A relevant question when considering scope and specificity. Or, tell me about why you chose the arrangement that you did. Some cards should be more self-evident than others. If you need to ask, are you talking about the current state or the future state? Or what kind of relationships are you showing here? Chances are that the model's not actually doing a good job being clear about those considerations. We can use the context priming cards in the same way, but we want to be particularly mindful of the intended audience's amount of context when we look at these. You can ask questions like, can you explain your title? Because I'm not seeing how it connects to what I'm seeing in the model. Or, I don't see a metaphor. Did you try to think one up? As we've been talking, such and such a metaphor comes to mind. If there's no written narrative, listen as they describe their model and consider if any of that explanation should be included in the model as the narrative. If the model isn't staged, do they present the model with a clear starting point? Could that be the beginning of a staging method of context priming? Again, not all models need all methods of context priming, particularly if they're for an audience that already has a lot of context for what's being talked about. The modeler needs to make a judgment call, and so should you as the critic. So you work through all the cards, and again, this is about modeling, so there's play, there's argument, there's discourse. Just like in an art critique, the criticism should be constructive and non-accusatory. The modeler should strive to be open and thankful for the thought and attention being given to their model and not always trying to defend their model. I say that like it's easy, but I know that I suck at it a lot. I don't take criticism well, especially on something that I've worked really hard at, but that's why we need that person, someone we can take risks with and who doesn't just criticize what we make, but also encourages us. So when we're the ones giving the critique, it's good to remember to be encouraging and generous in our ways of talking. And if we do encounter that defensiveness, to watch our own reaction so that we don't just get caught up in further defensiveness. We want to gently return to being supportive to the modeler as they work to make a good model, remembering that it's often easier to give critique than receive it. As I said at the start of the workshop, In the first video, doing something that you're unfamiliar with is uncomfortable. If you've not spent much time creating models or you've never shown your models to other people, it can be frightening to start. But this is a safe place for you to explore, play, get practice, and gain confidence. Thanks again for joining us in this modeling workshop. We've covered a lot, and you've done a ton of work, from learning about what a model is and why it's helpful, to how to set up a model for success before you even start modeling. You spent time making the complex clear both for yourself and then for others, and now you've learned how to apply all those methods of creating clear models as a modeler to helping others create clear models as a critic. This workshop would not have been the same without you. If you'd like to stay in touch, feel free to reach out on Slack or email. Additionally, Tug has a wonderful newsletter and is in all the social media places. I sure hope to see you again sometime soon. Bye.